It's been quite a few years now since I developed Limerence, and I thought it about time I sat down and spoke a bit about my experience, what I've learned from the condition, and perhaps maybe this will be the beginning of a series of video clips of various aspects of Limerence. Before I talk about the symptoms, I just want to clarify the term limerence, because it seems over the last few years that the term is being used in different ways. Some people use the term limerence to describe that energy that we all probably can relate to in new relationships, that new relationship energy, that euphoria, that sort of lustful love that is what we call eros love. It's a romantic love, and it comes from a very young part of us, and that's probably that is a normal part of attraction. You know, our biology is quite incredible that the drive to reproduce the human species is so strong that we've developed this this yearning to be with somebody else, to pair bond. And typically this energy lasts from 6 months to 3 years. That's just long enough for us to form a relationship with somebody, to procreate with them, have children, and hence the job's done as far as ensuring the survival of the species. Now, some commentators, as I said, that's what limerence is, and it's a natural phenomena. My feeling is, and I think that Tenov, when she first described this, is slightly different, and that is that when there is barriers to reciprocation, often when one person is married or both people are married and they decide that an affair is not appropriate, or if there's other barriers, if there's shyness where we find it very difficult to speak to the limerent object to actually find out if there's reciprocation, those barriers create this vicious cycle where we can't really know one way or the other, is there reciprocation or not. And even if there was reciprocation, in many cases that probably doesn't end the limerence because the barriers are still there, they're not removed, unless somebody goes off and has an affair, and that's a whole different ball game that I won't be covering here. Maybe I'll talk about that in other videos later on. So for me, limerence is something that's an enduring thing that can carry on. It can carry on for decades. I remember working with one client who was in his 70s and had met a woman when he was 18, his first real true love, and he said not a day went by where he hadn't still thought of her. So, and I know of other cases where people have had limerence for decades. So this 6 month to 3 year period where the neurochemicals normally subside doesn't always seem to work to plan for whatever reason. So that's just some clarification around the definition of limerence. Well, it was a condition that was first described in the 1970s by a psychologist by the name of Dorothy Tenov. And she described it as an involuntary state of mind which results from a romantic attraction to another person combined with an overwhelming and obsessive need to have one's feelings reciprocated. And I'll talk later on about the actual symptoms. There are a range of symptoms that we're impacted by. But let me start by just telling you a bit about my background and how I first came across the term and its impact upon me. I suppose it goes back to a course that I started about 6-7 years ago. And on that course, I'd met another person, a woman, and we'd only spoken a couple of times, no more than 20 minutes over the space of 2 evenings. And what I found was, after those 20 minutes, I was completely obsessed, sort of romantic infatuation by this woman. But it was more than just an infatuation. This was something that had hijacked my mind. This woman was on my mind pretty much 24/7. I was replaying every conversation that we had. I felt like I'd known her for a long time. This term that we hear, soulmates, this woman felt as though she was some deeply connected to me. And but what I couldn't quite understand was that I knew nothing about her. Literally 20 minutes conversation, that was it. So my head was telling me that this had to be something more than just falling in love. You know, I know that term that we hear, falling in love, love at first sight, well, for me that just doesn't jive. If we don't know anything about somebody, how can we feel such a deep connection? So it was that experience that really got me sort of reading more and delving into all the books that I could find around romantic attraction, around infatuation, around obsessive love, around love addiction. And I could see patterns and traits in myself, but there still wasn't anything that really resonated deeply with me. And it wasn't until about 4 or 5 months later that I was still struggling with feelings. I'd spoken to my wife about this, I'd been open with her, that I really started, I came across this term limerence and a forum on Tribe that described this condition limerence. And when I read the actual symptoms, I thought, wow, this is what I've been struggling with. This is it to an absolute T. And when I took it to my therapist, I'd been in therapy for a few years before this had struck, and also marriage counselling. My therapist had never heard of the term, and she said, well, this is, we had been talking about this in therapy for a while, but she said, this is just an infatuation. I said, no, this is something way more than infatuation. This is something that's just taken me over. It was like an addiction to another person. There were shades of OCD, of obsessive compulsive disorder within this, and it was just so debilitating, this condition. So that was a revelation when I came across Tribe, and I got a lot of support and help through that forum. Sadly, that forum no longer exists. The whole Tribe platform is defunct, but a couple of years back I decided that firstly, the technology that Tribe used wasn't great, and also there had been outages where the site wasn't accessible. And I thought that it's a shame that we're going to lose this ability to share experiences for this condition. So that was the motivation to set up Limerence.net, and perhaps fortuitous I did, because Tribe eventually did go down about 18 months ago, and this then became a place where a number of the Tribe members moved to, and since then it's grown. Anyway, let's talk a bit about the actual symptoms. Now this is taken from a paper. There's a really good paper out on the internet by a guy called Albert Wakin, W-A-K-I-N. And if you Google Wakin Limerence PDF, it will give you a link to this paper. And it's a very eloquent paper. It's only 6 pages long. And he lists the symptoms. And it's one of the best lists that I've seen. And he describes them in 5 core areas. Firstly, intrusive and obsessive thinking about the limerent object. Now, the LO, the limerent object, this is what we call the person that we're infatuated with. And actually, calling it an object is very appropriate, because limerence is complete objectification. As I said, the reality is we don't really know this person deep down, and so what we are doing is that we are objectifying them. And there's a whole field of psychology called object relations theory that ties into this. So the LO is a very apt name. So what are the symptoms? As I said, there's 5 core areas, and I'll go through these in a bit more detail. There's the intrusive and obsessive thinking about the limerent object. There's the replay and rehearsal. There's the anxiety and self-consciousness. There's the emotional dependence. And then there's the impaired functioning. And as I said, when I read these symptoms, I thought, bingo, this is me to a T. I was struggling with pretty much most of these. So first off, let's look at the intrusive and obsessive thinking about the limerent object. This is where we spend more time thinking about the LO more than anything else. As I said before, my mind had felt like it had been hijacked. I probably spent initially in the first few weeks 90% of my thinking time thinking about this other person. It really was nuts. It was crazy making. Difficulty avoiding, reducing, stopping, focusing and concentrating on the limerent object despite voluntary control. And I really got a sense of what addiction was like, because however much I tried, I could not stop these repetitive mindsets that were going around and round in my head. It was nigh impossible. Distraction to the point where relationships and responsibilities are compromised. And for me, absolutely, this was a big issue. I pretty much stopped working on my business. I couldn't function. I found it very difficult. And then there's replay and rehearsal. This is the second group. This is where we become very sensitive to the limerent object's cues. We observe minutely how they are around us. We're looking for signals. We start looking on the internet about body language, trying to understand, does this person like us or not? Because limerence really is fueled by uncertainty. That is one of the key conditions that fuels this. Replaying events. This is something that many people, if not all of us with limerence, do or have done, that we're constantly going over interactions. What did they mean? What did they say? What happened there? What was she thinking? What was he thinking about me? And then more often than not, constantly anticipating or rehearsing events that have yet to occur. So we would spend a lot of time in the fantasy, thinking about what were we going to say? How are we going to respond in a certain situation? And of course, the reality never matched the fantasy, because when we were in these situations, they never played out, or rarely played out how they were in our mind. And then, more often than not, constantly imagining vivid experiences in which the limerent object reciprocates our feelings and intentions. And again, so much of the fantasy for us limerents is tied up with running off into the sunset, perhaps renting a hotel room and having hot, passionate sex with this person. Whatever it is for the person, it will be different for each of us. And then, such imagined experiences create feelings of hopefulness for reciprocation. So it's that constant urge, that need almost to be hoping that we're seen, that we're validated at some level by the limerent object. And again, Wakin says that more often than not, these actions compromise our efficiency and productivity. And boy, do they. As I said, I just stopped functioning completely. And for me, it really was a catalyst into something much more significant, into a period of emotional growth. I'll come back to that afterwards, though. The third set he talks about is around anxiety and self-consciousness. So we make constant attempts to present ourselves, our physical appearance, our behaviour, our attitudes in a more positive way. I lost about a stone in the first few weeks of limerence. We start taking more interest in how we look. You'll hear stories of people going to the gym, working out, getting fitter, women starting to wear more makeup, changing our clothes so we look more attractive. We really become sort of hypersensitive, it's sort of hyper alert around our limerent object, to wanting to make a good impression. We also get a whole range of physiological symptoms. So feelings of shyness, embarrassment and anxiety. We might get shortness of breath, palpitations, perspiring. I remember somebody saying to me when I was around my limerent object, this friend said to me, "What's wrong with you? You look like a rabbit in the headlights." And that's what it felt like. I really felt like I just couldn't function normally around the limerent object. Socially inept in the presence of the limerent object. So stuttering, clumsy, awkward behaviour. For me, that wasn't so much of an issue, but I know many people become sort of frozen by fear or become mute. They find it very difficult to talk. Shyness, embarrassment and anxiety are heightened in the actual or imagined presence of the limerent object. And again, I can relate to those feelings of anxiety, of not so much shyness, but certainly being very self-conscious around the limerent object. And then a very important one, a strong enduring fear that we're going to be rejected by our limerent object. Then the fourth group of symptoms, emotional dependence. So there's a strong, persistent, enduring yearning for reciprocation. And because we are locked in this limbo land and we somehow find it very difficult to speak honestly with our limerent object, and even if we did, is that appropriate? And even if it was appropriate, are they able to be honest with us as to how they feel? But this desire, this yearning for reciprocation. Feelings of depression or apprehension are intensified with increased uncertainty and or increased signs of rejection. So again, as I said, for many of us, we go into a real funk. It really is a roller coaster ride. So we get the euphoria that limerence actually, the research shows that when we're limerent, that there's a release of neurochemicals of dopamine, which is exactly the same neurochemical that's released when we snort cocaine. So that when we're around our limerent object, we're actually getting a drug high. We're euphoric. And then when we are not around our limerent object, or when they don't reciprocate our feelings, or we're not sure, we crash. We go into this real low, and it really is a roller coaster ride. And finally, the impaired functioning, the fifth group, where Wakin talks about significant relationships and responsibilities are compromised due to the preoccupation, and I've touched on that already. How we are completely preoccupied with the limerent object, with the fantasy. So that's the symptoms. Well, as I said before, I think that the early new relationship energy is a normal phenomena for most of us, or probably all of us. It's part of it's hardwired into the human species. But I think that where we get stuck in this cycle of this obsession, this infatuation, this addiction, I think that a lot of that is due to early life trauma, and that I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about attachment theory, because I think this is central to limerence. Now, this is just my own belief, but I think others also that I communicate with on the limerence.net website share this belief as well. But it's not the only reason, but I think it's a significant part of this. And I would add to this that I see this in the couples work I do with my wife in our love relations practice, that we see this as well in couples where there's infidelity, that when we look at the actual reasons or the origins of the person that's having the affair, where does that come from? And again, it's invariably there's early life trauma. So attachment theory was a concept that was developed by a British psychiatrist called John Bowlby in the 1930s. And the research at that time, the feeling was that how we connect with our primary caregiver, generally our mother, in the first few years of life is critical to how securely we feel in life, to how grounded we are, how we are in relationships, that are we secure and confident in ourselves? Do we feel good about ourselves? Do we have good self-esteem? And those children that had mothers that were present, that were not emotionally anxious or emotionally absent, that they got good mirroring. Their mothers were present, they were there, they were giving them unconditional love, they were available for them. When the child got hungry, the mum would feed them. The child wouldn't be left to scream. And that child learns that the world is safe, it's okay, that when I get anxious, my mother will come or my primary caregiver will come, and I won't be alone, I won't die, I won't be annihilated. And those children grow up to be called what we call securely attached. Then you have children who, and again, this is, as I said, this is just a general theory, you have children whose mothers were very anxious, who, for whatever their own upbringing, their own imprinting, were not able to be completely present for their children. They had a lot of anxiety. And that child, the baby, even though we don't have words, picks up on that anxiety. And those children could become what we call anxiously attached. And then there's a third group where the mother can be quite smothering to the child, or quite distant. And these children grow up to be avoidant sometimes. So as I said, this isn't clear cut, but there certainly is patterns that we recognise where babies grow up without secure attachment. Now my own belief is that actually the vast majority of us grow up either insecurely or anxiously attached. I meet very few people in life who I would feel are securely attached, who've got good enough mothering or good enough unconditional positive regard, as Carl Rogers used to call it.